We begin, though, this morning in Ukraine and that growing skepticism over the Russian pledge to scale back its military activity in the capital city, Kyiv, and the northern city of Chernihiv.
Russia's deputy defense minister made that announcement after yesterday's peace talks in Turkey, saying his country wanted to, quote, increase mutual trust. Ukraine's President Zelensky described the negotiations as positive, but said Ukrainians are not naive. He's vowing to keep up defensive efforts. The United States is also expressing doubt, with President Biden saying he would wait and see. Speaking in Morocco yesterday, Secretary of State Antony Blinken echoed that sentiment and seemed to downplay the progress of those peace talks.
I have not seen anything that suggests that this is moving forward in an effective way, because Russia, at least we've not seen signs of real seriousness. But if Ukraine concludes that there is, that's good, and we support that. Whether it's simply trying to regroup, given the heavy losses that it suffered, I don't know. So we're focused on what they do.
Our team is standing by around the world to bring you the latest on the events in Ukraine. And later on, we'll be joined by national security expert Jason Beardsley and NBC News White House correspondent Carol Lee. But before that, let's head to NBC News correspondent Gabe Gutierrez in Lviv. Gabe, good morning. So we heard that pledge from Russia after yesterday's peace talks to scale back military activity in those two places I mentioned, Kyiv and Chernihiv. Are the Russians keeping their word? I mean, it doesn't necessarily sound like we think that's the case, but what's the situation like in and around those cities right now?
Hey there, Savannah. Good morning. Well, you're right. The governor of Chernihiv said this morning that shelling continued there overnight, and while shelling did not happen in the actual capital of Kyiv, in and around it, the fighting has continued. So that fuels the skepticism that Russia would concede any part of that region. As you heard Secretary of State Blinken say, and other military analysts say, that it's possible that Russia could be using this as a ploy to refuel, to replenish its forces. The Ministry of Defense in the UK says that some Russian forces had been going back, either back to Russia or neighboring Belarus, in order to do just that. The fighting is intensifying, though, in other cities, for example, Kharkiv to the northeast, and also, as we've been reporting, Mariupol to the south, where more than 160,000 residents, according to Ukrainian officials, are still there, suffering through a desperate humanitarian crisis as the shelling intensifies in that southern region. Savannah?
So, Gabe, despite all this wariness about what Russia is saying, President Zelensky also said there were positive signs from yesterday's talks. Is there a feeling on the ground that this war is now entering some type of new phase?
The blunt answer is not really, Joe. This morning, within the past several hours, a Kremlin spokesperson has said that there has been no breakthrough offered by these peace talks. And you have to remember, any agreements, if there were any agreement reached following these talks, it would have to undergo a national referendum in order to be accepted by Ukraine. And Ukrainian officials say that they can't do a national referendum while there are still Russian troops in this country. So while, yes, it's a glimmer of hope, perhaps, at this point, though, it appears there is no end to this war in sight.
And, Gabe, away from Ukraine's capital, Russian forces are continuing to bombard cities over in the south and in the east. That includes the port city of Mykolaiv. What can you tell us about, there was a strike on a government building. What do we know about that?
Yes, Mykolaiv is to the west of Mariupol, and it's another one of the cities that has been targeted by Russian forces over the last several days. A government building was hit there. It was the home of the region's governor, not the home, but the office of the region's governor, according to Ukrainian officials. At least 8 people killed there and at least 22 others wounded. And Ukrainian officials are pointing to that as another reason why they say the Russians cannot be trusted. And while as this intense fighting continues in the southern part of the country, as well as the eastern and to some extent the northern part of the country, while that shelling continues, while the fighting does intensify in those areas, it's very difficult to get to any sort of peace deal or any sort of ceasefire, which again seems far off at this point. Right, Savannah and Joe.
Gabe Gutierrez in Ukraine. Gabe, thank you.
Let's now bring in NBC News White House correspondent Carol Lee. She's in Washington for us. Carol, good morning. So many Ukrainians are skeptical of Russia's promise to scale back its military activities, and it seems that's also the case here in the U.S. Tell us the latest on the White House response to that claim.
That is absolutely the case here in the U.S., Savannah. We've heard that from a number of officials. There's skepticism and caution about what Russia says it will do, and that's based on a long history of Russia saying one thing and then doing another. So we heard from Secretary of State Antony Blinken that the goal is to look at what Russia does, not what it says. Other White House officials have reiterated the same sort of sentiment, and President Biden himself addressed this yesterday. Take a listen.
I don't read anything into it until I see what their actions are. We'll see if they follow through on what they're suggesting. We're going to continue to keep strong the sanctions. We're going to continue to provide the Ukrainian military with their capacity to defend themselves.
Now, one thing that we heard from administration officials in the last 24 hours is that they're seeing some Russian troops move away from Kyiv. And what they're also saying, though, is that doesn't mean that this is somehow some big shift in the war here, that this is possibly more likely the Russians just regrouping, and that the threat is still very real. Savannah.
Carol, also on a call with European allies, President Biden talked about taking further steps to both punish Russia and help Ukraine. What options are the White House considering?
Well, they're looking at a number of things, including in lockstep, hopefully, from their perspective, with U.S. allies. And that includes more military assistance to the Ukrainians. As you know, there's a desperate need, according to President Zelensky, for more military aid. So that's something that they're looking at. And also humanitarian aid. One of the things that we heard from the White House after that call was that they were particularly looking at getting humanitarian assistance to residents in Mariupol. So that's something that they're considering, and this is just going to be ongoing. This is a need that's not going away anytime soon. So both military assistance as well as humanitarian assistance.
Absolutely. And also, let's talk a little bit about what could potentially happen here, especially after those peace talks yesterday. Ukraine's president has said he's open to declaring his country neutral, ending that bid to join the NATO alliance, but he does want a new, stronger security framework to guarantee Western protection if Russia attacks again. Tell us some of the details of that, what really is different, therefore, than joining something like NATO, and if it's something that the White House is open to.
Well, so far, Savannah, we have seen the White House really not weigh in heavily on this. We heard from the communications director, Kate Bedingfield, yesterday saying that they just weren't going to talk about any details of this. They haven't committed to doing anything. But the way this would work is that if Ukraine is not going to join NATO and have that cover, then they want some kind of guarantee that if Russia were to attack again, that allies would come to their aid. So create things like a no-fly zone. And now that has been a non-starter in this current conflict for the U.S. and NATO allies. So it's not exactly clear how this would work, but you can see why the Ukrainians are saying this. They're looking at this and does Russia come in and they get a peace deal, and then that Russia comes back in a few years, as we saw after the annexation of Crimea, and tries to take another chunk of the country. They want some kind of guarantee, if it's not going to be NATO, that the U.S. and other allies will come to their aid if that were to happen. There's just not any consensus within the Biden administration on how that would work and what they would commit to.
All right, Carol Lee, thank you so much.
Let's go to national security expert Jason Beardsley now for more on the situation. He's the national executive director at the Association of the U.S. Navy. So, Jason, the Pentagon doesn't seem convinced Russia is going to go through with scaling back its forces around Kyiv. Here's what Press Secretary John Kirby said yesterday.
Nobody should be fooling ourselves by the Kremlin's now recent claim that it will suddenly just reduce military attacks near Kyiv, or any reports that it's going to withdraw all its forces. We believe that this is a repositioning, not a real withdrawal, and that we all should be prepared to watch for a major offensive against other areas of Ukraine.
So do you agree, and how do you think the U.S. should keep the pressure on Moscow to try and honor this proposed drawdown? Is it more sanctions, more support for Ukraine?
Right. Well, in total, I'm not sure I fully agree with their assessments. I think the Pentagon and the White House have to be careful about what they say. But let's go back and rewind a little bit. Before this invasion, the White House was fairly confident that they were going to invade. And why were they confident? They were reading the movements on the ground. They were looking at the tanks. They were looking at the armies massing on the borders. Well, they're not really applying the same logic here. The Russians have really been getting hammered from day one of their invasion. We watched and looked for a 48-hour type invasion to decapitate the government. It did not happen. And you watched analysts and pundits all over the media struggling to figure out what was going wrong with the Russian army. We've had this sort of this paper tiger approach, puffing up Vladimir Putin, puffing up the military. This has shown us in the last 4 weeks, if you haven't been able to figure out, the Russians are not winning. They're losing. They're trying to save face, and they're lying about their new goals or their achieved gains. So I think it's much wiser to look at this from the perspective of they're getting a little bit beleaguered, their lines are extended, and they're having to resort to the Russians dealing with the East. So I think the Pentagon's smart to be cautious about it, but I don't think we need to overread into what the Russians are saying. They're going to lie on the face of it, but at the end of the day, we can analyze this pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, so do you think this potential shift by Russia is mainly just because of the Ukraine's resistance on the ground, or how much of a role do you think sanctions may also be playing?
No, 100% Ukrainians on the ground. 10% what the sanctions are doing. The sanctions are a long-term financial burn effort that will hamper the production capability for Russia down the line. But that has nothing to do with their effect on the ground now. However, folks in the Kremlin, folks in the Duma, they are putting the pressure on Putin themselves. You can hear it from their generals. They've talked about or signaled or lied or prevaricated about what they're doing now because they're embarrassed. Look, the Ukrainians have been creative. They've been adaptive. They knocked out a Russian ship. The Russian naval fleet down in Crimea could not get conscripts into the fight. That's because a lot of them are from Ukraine. You're seeing tanks blown up all over the place. Your reports are showing that. So what we're really seeing is the Russians are going to resort to trying to control the East. And if the Ukrainians want to break that resistance, it's going to mean more lethal weapons and more creativity in the next 2 weeks.
I mean, do you think that is Russia's main goal right now, trying to control the eastern part of the region in hopes of annexing it as Russian territory like Crimea in 2014?
Absolutely. I think it's a great point. A lot of us got this wrong from the beginning. I'm one of them because we assessed that there was no need for Russia to do a full-scale invasion because really the assessment on the ground is they really wanted to control that east of the Dnieper River so they could get the land bridge down to Crimea and fuel their resupply routes by land. So, yes, I think that's Russia's gain now. But look, if Ukraine plays its cards right and if the White House really gets involved in continuing the supplies, humanitarian and lethal aid, they can break the Russians even off from that and back them off the table because no matter how this ends, the negotiations are where this gets really difficult.
Jason Beardsley, always appreciate your analysis and your candor. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Let's get more on the fallout from those peace talks with NBC News senior international correspondent Keir Simmons. He joins us from Istanbul, Turkey. Keir, good morning. So Turkey's foreign minister said yesterday's talks made, quote, the most significant progress yet. One of the significant developments being Russia claiming it plans to scale back military operations in certain areas. But there's skepticism around that. Tell us, though, what exactly we have heard from Russia on this.
Well, you know, Savannah, that really, you just summed it up, what we've heard from Russia from those talks in the building behind me here. I think, frankly, the truth is that yesterday, mostly what we heard was from the Ukrainians. So we heard a number of proposals from the Ukrainians that Ukraine would be prepared to be neutral, not have Western bases on Ukrainian territory. They proposed a 15-year plan for Crimea. They proposed a new strategic framework for Ukraine, which would involve Western countries guaranteeing Ukraine's safety. The Russians called that constructive and said that they would take those ideas back to President Putin. Again, I think it's notable that we didn't hear many political proposals from the Russians. But that being said, what we did see, despite the conversation you were just having about the continued fighting in Ukraine, I think we did see a little bit of political progress yesterday. And let's just put it in context. It's possible to argue that this conflict began 14 years ago and has been burning hot and cold since then. One day's talks are not going to solve that.
Yeah, and Keir, I mean, let's talk more about what Ukraine is proposing. That includes the offer to become neutral in exchange for security guarantees. How would that work? Is it something Russia would accept? And what exactly are we hearing as far as Russia's demands right now?
Well, that's right. I mean, it's a great question because we haven't even got to the debate, if you like, about how Ukraine's ideas might work. I mean, if you just take that idea of a new strategic framework, what they appear to want is countries, including NATO countries, to say that they will come to Ukraine's aid should there be another conflict with Russia, particularly one led by Russia. Well, how do you do that? Does that even fit with the agreements that the NATO countries themselves have? Would Russia even agree to that, or would it just see as a kind of quasi NATO but not called NATO? So I mean, there are just so many issues here. I mean, I think the important thing really from a political point of view is that, just think about this, they didn't shake hands at the beginning of the meeting behind me here. There was even talk from the Ukrainian foreign minister to the Ukrainians in the room, don't drink anything, don't eat anything, don't touch any services because they might be poisoned. Well, we've come a little bit further from that complete lack of trust.
I actually have a question kind of related to some of that. So, and thank you for those details from in the room. So among those present at yesterday's peace talks was Russian oligarch and the Chelsea soccer club owner. A lot of people know this name now, Roman Abramovich. Do we know what kind of role he's playing there? Why is he in these talks? And also, talk to us about this report by this investigative group, Bellingcat, that he and some members of the Ukrainian negotiating team suffered symptoms, to your point just a moment ago, quote, consistent with poisoning from talks earlier this month. What is going on there?
Yeah, those claims are pretty murky. I mean, clearly Roman Abramovich, which his side believes that to be the case. It's disputed by others, including some on the Western side. So we simply don't know about that. Roman Abramovich obviously is sanctioned. He is a Russian oligarch. He's been invited here by the Ukrainians. I mean, it kind of underscores what an extraordinary event it was here yesterday, with the Turkish President Erdogan standing and giving a speech to the two sides, and they all stood up and clapped him, cheered him for trying to bring them together. So, yeah, there were a lot of moments yesterday to raise eyebrows, but ultimately, in the end, of course, it's going to be a question of what deal is done, whether there is a peace deal, and then crucially, and I think this is really important, it's not just about whether there's a peace deal, but what kind of sustainable peace, sustainable agreement the two sides at some point manage to reach.
Absolutely. All right, Keir Simmons, thank you so much. Let's now get a check on your morning news now weather.
Bill Cairns is with us. Hey, Bill, good morning.
Hey, good Wednesday morning. So we made it through last night's severe weather. You know, not totally unscathed, but we didn't do so badly. We had 25,000 people without power in Texas and Oklahoma. Could have been a lot worse. But today was the day we were worried about all along. I think that we easily could see, we may even approach 1 million people without power if these storms set up the way that the way they look like they will. So let me show you why today looks like a dangerous day. So first off, we do have a tornado watch that is issued for areas from Shreveport to Alexandria up towards Little Rock, and this will continue into the early afternoon. So there is the potential, at least, for isolated tornadoes. We haven't had any so far with this outbreak. And then as we go throughout the afternoon, all that warm, humid air comes off the Gulf. It's just really just a classic recipe. And at the same time, strong winds in the mid to upper levels where the jets fly is going to be racing from the Four Corner region through Texas. That's what's going to support these storms. And that's why this looks like a bullseye map. And unfortunately, it's over the same areas that were hit last week. So anywhere from the yellow all the way to the red has a risk of strong storms. We call it a slight risk, enhanced risk, moderate risk. But if you're in the higher color regions on the, from the legend, that means you have a greater chance of seeing the severe weather and a greater concentration of those storms. So we're really thinking that the best chance for significant damage would be from Memphis to Greenville, Biloxi, Mobile, everywhere in Mississippi, actually, western Tennessee. And then later tonight, this all slides into areas of Alabama, then late tonight towards Atlanta. So again, widespread wind damage with these storms and the chance for a strong tornado or two. And then tomorrow, the storm system will weaken, but there's still at least a slight risk of severe storms from Tallahassee up to Savannah into areas of southern portions of South Carolina, and then an area from Richmond to D.C. to Baltimore. So we're talking about a pretty highly populated corridor there. And if that wasn't bad enough, we still have a very windy day with wind damage possible just from the storm itself. From Memphis all the way to New Orleans. So I guess you guys get the picture. This is kind of a classic spring setup. We're hoping we can get through today without any, horrific tornadoes and injuries and fatalities, but the potential is there.
Yeah, hopefully. Busy week, my goodness. All right.
Yeah, wow.
Thank you, Bill.
Thanks, Bill. Now to the latest on the January 6th insurrection. The House committee investigating the riot is preparing for the testimony of Jared Kushner, son-in-law and senior advisor to former President Donald Trump. It comes after an explosive new report shows a gap of more than 7 hours in phone records President Trump handed over to the panel, a period in which the Capitol was being invaded. NBC News senior congressional correspondent Garrett Haake joins us now with the latest on this. Hey, Garrett, good morning.
Hey, Savannah, good morning. Yeah, look, this is shaping up to be a critical week for the January 6th committee. As you mentioned, they're going deeper into Donald Trump's inner circle than they ever have before. And now they're trying to solve this mystery of what exactly the then president did and did not do during the hours of the attack itself. The January 6th committee now pushing further than ever into Donald Trump's inner circle, expecting testimony Thursday from Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor, Jared Kushner.
We know there were a lot of Trump family members who tried to intercede to get Donald Trump to call off the dogs on January 6th.
The critical interview coming amid a week of major developments in the investigation. The committee focusing on what the Washington Post reports was a 7-hour gap in Mr. Trump's January 6th call logs and White House diaries.
We have multiple points of evidence to try to fill in what was Donald Trump doing and of perhaps greater importance, what was he failing to do while the Capitol was being attacked? And so we are able to put those pieces together even when we get incomplete records.
The Post reporting that the gap covered the same period of time of the key moments of the attack, as the rioters entered the Capitol and lawmakers, including Vice President Pence, fled the building. The committee would not comment, but NBC News has reported that a set of call records turned over to the committee did not show any calls to or from Trump on the afternoon of the riot. The full House now also preparing to vote to recommend holding 2 top Trump aides in contempt of Congress for refusing to comply with subpoenas. Senior aides Dan Scavino and Peter Navarro each claiming executive privilege. Mr. Trump standing by his false claims about the election in a statement responding, Republicans must get tough and smart and not let them get away with the crime of the century. This, as a federal judge said Monday, Trump, quote, more likely than not, committed a crime in his attempts to obstruct the vote on January 6th. The judge ordering Trump attorney John Eastman to turn over more than 100 emails he had sought to shield from the committee. Savannah, when we first started reporting about this gap in the call logs back in February, the committee thought there were 3 possibilities. First, that the call logs had been altered. Second, that they were incomplete. Or third, that then President Trump was simply using someone else's phone or phones. Those are still the active possibilities. But as time grows short for this committee, the pressure increases for them to figure out exactly what was going on during the attack.
Absolutely. A lot to watch for there. Garrett, remember earlier this week when you were on a fun tour of the Capitol, and now as you were?
That feels like a very long time ago.
Thank you, Garrett.
It's a different type of tour. Former President Trump is publicly calling on Vladimir Putin to release information he might have on Hunter Biden, President Biden's son. Here's Trump in an interview with Just the News yesterday.
Why did the mayor of Moscow's wife give the Bidens, both of them, $3.5 million for them? That's a lot of money. She gave him $3.5 million. So now I would think Putin would know the answer to that. I think he should release it. I think we should know that answer.
So Trump is referring to an unsubstantiated claim made in a 2020 report by Senate Republicans focusing on Hunter Biden's business dealings in Ukraine. At the time, Hunter Biden's legal team told NBC News that he had no stake in the firm that received that money, and his lawyers have consistently denied any wrongdoing. Putin has also pushed back, saying in 2020 that he was unaware of any business dealings between Biden and the widow of Moscow's former mayor. This, of course, is not the first time that Trump has asked Putin to dig up dirt on his enemies. In 2016, he Cheney famously called on Russia to find and release Hillary Clinton's emails. Trump's first impeachment centered on his effort to pressure Ukrainian President Zelensky to find incriminating information about the Biden family.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.